"This is where you get off," he said. His voice was cold, too calm for what he was doing. Eric didn't look at me as he put the car in park, just stared ahead, tapping the steering wheel like he was waiting on a red light. The fog clung to the trees like old ghosts. Coastal Oregon in April. It could make anything look haunted. Even your own son. "This is your stop, Mom." I laughed. I thought he was joking. I actually laughed. I looked down at my feet, still in Henry's old slippers, the ones I kept wearing around the house since the funeral. The ones I meant to replace next time I went into town. "You can't be serious," I said, voice light, testing. Eric turned to me. That's when I knew it was real. He handed me my purse. "The house and the business are mine now. Susan's already changing the locks." For a second, I couldn't breathe. I blinked hard, waiting for him to laugh, to shake his head, to say this was some kind of awful misunderstanding. But he didn't. He put the car in reverse. My door was already open, and I was standing on the gravel shoulder of an empty road. "This is insane," I said softly. "You can't just—" "Eric, I'm your mother." He didn't look back, just said, "You'll figure something out, you always do," and then he was gone. No suitcase, no phone, no money. Just a coat, my purse, and the long, curling sound of tires on wet road. I didn't cry. Not then. I stood there, spine stiffening against the damp, the salt-heavy wind from the ocean curling into my hair like fingers. That fog rolled in deeper now, swallowing up the taillights of my son's car, and with it the life I'd spent 40 years building. But here's what Eric never understood. I wasn't alone. I was free. He thought he'd discarded me. What he'd really done was release something he couldn't see coming. Because he had no idea what I'd done before his father died. We buried Henry 6 days earlier. I barely remember the funeral, just the way my heels sank into the wet grass and how Eric wouldn't look me in the eye. Susan clung to his arm like a vine, choking a tree. "She's not thinking clearly," Susan had whispered to the pastor afterward, loud enough for me to hear. "It's the grief. She's not making rational decisions." Now, standing in the cold mist, I saw what that whisper had been, the start of a coup. Henry had trusted Eric with the hospice paperwork. I hadn't wanted to bother my son. He had enough on his plate, I told myself. I just wanted Henry to have dignity in those final weeks. But somewhere in those papers, somewhere amid the pills and the bed baths and the sleepless nights, something else had been slipped in. Something with my name on it. Something forged. I didn't know the full extent then, but I knew enough to be afraid and to be angry. Because this wasn't just about betrayal. This was about theft of everything. My husband, my home, my voice in the very business Henry and I built from scratch, the bed and breakfast that started with 2 rooms and a stovetop. I scrubbed myself every night for 15 years. Eric had always been clever, even as a boy. Too clever, if I'm honest. The kind of clever that grows dangerous when wrapped in entitlement and nudged along by a woman like Susan. I started walking. I didn't know where to, only that I couldn't stay there. My knees ached. My mouth was dry. But I walked, past dripping trees, past old fence posts laced with moss. And somewhere between mile 3 and 4, a thought settled over me like a wool blanket. They think they've won. Eric, with his smooth lies and Susan's brittle smile. They think I'm done. But they forgot something. I still have Henry's ledger. I still have the safe deposit box. As I walked the foggy road toward town, each step echoed, with Eric's betrayal still ringing in my ears. I still have the name he never took off that deed. And I am not dead yet. The mist clung to my coat like sweat. My legs burned, my breath turned shallow. But I didn't stop. Not because I wasn't tired. Lord, I was. But because stopping meant thinking, and thinking might break me. There wasn't a soul for miles, just the crunch of gravel and the occasional flap of wings overhead. That old ache in my hips flared with every incline, and my hands, stiff with arthritis, were balled in my coat pockets. Still, I didn't cry. Instead, I thought about the lunch boxes I used to pack, turkey sandwiches cut into dinosaur shapes, little notes folded into the side pocket. "You're brave. You're kind. I love you, Mom." I'd saved every one of Eric's kindergarten drawings. Even the scribbles he claimed were blue whales, but looked more like melting clouds. I was the mother who read 4 books at bedtime, who learned how to braid action figures into his hair because he liked warrior styles, who worked 2 jobs after Henry's back gave out so Eric wouldn't miss summer camp. And now? Discarded, like trash on the side of a road. I shook my head, more in disbelief than sorrow. That boy who once ran into my arms after a schoolyard fight, crying because someone called me too old to be a real mom, when did he stop looking at me like I mattered? When did love stop being enough? After what must have been 6 miles, I saw the chipped sign for Grace's General. My legs nearly gave out at the sight. Grace had run the store since I was young, long before she added the espresso machine and the rack of organic dog treats. The place still smelled like cedar chips and menthol. The bell over the door gave a weak jingle when I stepped inside. Grace looked up from behind the counter, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "Linda?" she said, voice sharp with concern. "You look like hell." "I feel like it," I replied, my lips too cold to smile. She came around the counter, wrapped me in her arms before I could protest. "What on earth happened?" "I walked," I said simply. "From the junction." Grace pulled back and stared at me like I'd sprouted horns. "That's 8 damn miles. 6 and change," I muttered, "depending on where you measure from." She sat me down, wrapped a fleece blanket around my shoulders, and handed me a styrofoam cup of coffee that steamed like a miracle. "Where's Eric?" My throat tightened. "Gone." Her eyes flickered. "Linda, what do you mean, gone?" I couldn't answer. Not fully. Not yet. She didn't press, just patted my hand. "You sit. Rest. I'll make you a sandwich." While I sat there sipping coffee that tasted more like kindness than caffeine, a sentence kept repeating itself in my mind like a hymn. What is love without respect? I used to think love was the anchor, the thing that held everything steady through the storms. But anchors drag, don't they? They keep you stuck. Respect, though, that's the wind in your sails. I had loved Eric completely, fiercely, but I'd let him stop respecting me somewhere along the way. When he stopped calling, unless he needed money. When Susan started making those tight-lipped suggestions about me slowing down. When I let them take over Henry's medical bills without asking where the checks were going. I told myself it was generosity, flexibility. But now, wrapped in a blanket in Grace's store, with feet blistered and pride bleeding, I saw it clearly. I hadn't been generous. I'd been groomed. I called a cab from Grace's landline. She offered to drive me, but I couldn't bear the kindness of it. Not yet. The driver didn't ask questions. Just took me to a small motor lodge off the highway, the kind truckers use when the roads get icy. I paid cash from the emergency money tucked in the lining of my purse. Henry's idea. He always said, a woman should never be caught without a backup. And as I stood in that dusty room with the flickering sconce and the worn quilt, I whispered aloud what I hadn't dared say since Henry passed. "You were right, darling. I should have seen this coming." But even now, through the ache and the shock and the unbearable silence, I wasn't broken, not yet. The next morning, as I sat on the edge of the motel bed, I remembered the roses we planted our first spring at the inn. They were Henry's idea. He said the guests should smell something sweet the moment they stepped out of their cars. First impressions matter, he told me, his hands buried in damp soil. We bought 6 bushes, 2 red, 2 peach, 2 yellow, and planted them in a curved row near the front path. I remember the way the sun caught in his hair that day, already silvering at the temples, and how Eric, just 7 then, chased a green rubber ball between the flower beds, laughing so hard he hiccuped. It had been a good day, a perfect day if I'm honest. I sat in that memory like a warm bath, letting it soften the corners of the cold motel room. Outside, the fog hadn't lifted, but the light was brighter, less heavy. Back then, the inn was just a dream with drywall. We only had 2 rooms ready, and a breakfast menu scrawled on notebook paper. Henry did the electrical himself, and I painted every single piece of trim in that place until my wrists gave out. But when we opened, it was magic. Our first guests were a couple from Idaho, newly retired. They said the place reminded them of something from a storybook. I made blueberry scones that morning, and Henry beamed at me across the table like I'd given them the moon. Eric had passed out keys, told them about the hiking trails. Stood tall and proud, just like his father. He was so eager to help back then, always watching, always mimicking Henry. For a long time, I let myself believe the business would one day be his, that he'd carry it forward with the same care we did, that it would be a family legacy, not just a property line. But somewhere between those blueberry scones and now, something changed. I opened the dresser drawer in the motel room and found a Gideon Bible, a takeout menu, and a pack of matches with a local auto shop logo on them. I stared at the matches for a long moment, not because I needed them, but because I was trying to remember the last time I'd been in a place that felt this anonymous. I'd spent 40 years greeting guests with a tray of muffins and a handwritten welcome note. 40 years knowing that someone, somewhere, needed directions or warm towels or help finding a local bakery. I had lived a life in motion. Now, I was still. Later that afternoon, I went out walking again. Slower this time, deliberate. My knees were protesting, but I needed the air. There was a park nearby, a little stretch of grass and gravel with 2 picnic tables and a weathered swing set. I sat on the edge of one bench and watched a mother wrangle a toddler into a puffy coat. She looked exhausted. The kind of tired I remembered from my own days, chasing after Eric, trying to keep him fed and clean and halfway decent in public. He'd been a handful. Smart, stubborn. Sensitive, too. Back then, at least. I used to sing to him when he couldn't sleep. Made up lullabies about dragons who just wanted a quiet cave and a soft blanket. He would curl against me like a puppy, eyes heavy, fingers tangled in my hair. Where did that boy go? Back in the motel room, I found my journal in the side pocket of my purse. It was a worn leather one Henry gave me 2 Christmases ago. Still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. I flipped past the empty pages and found the last thing I'd written, months ago, before Henry died. Don't let them push you aside. You still have a name on the deed. His handwriting. His last note to me, left on the fridge the week he stopped walking. It felt like a flare in the dark. He knew. Even in his final days, he'd seen something coming. And maybe I did too. Maybe I'd just been too afraid to name it. But now it had a name. Betrayal. And it had a face. Eric's. That night, I lay in the 2-firm motel bed and stared at the water-stained ceiling. I didn't cry, but I did whisper, "I miss you, Henry." Then, after a long pause, "I think I'm finally ready to do what you told me." It wasn't just one moment that warned me. It was 100 little signs I chose to ignore. The warnings were soft at first, not screams, just whispers, like how Eric stopped calling unless something needed fixing. Or funding. "How's the plumbing holding up?" he'd ask, and I'd think, "How nice, he's concerned," until 3 minutes later came. Because Susan's cousin knows a guy who could redo the whole system for $15,000. Or how Susan always smiled at me with her mouth but never her eyes. Always just a little too warm. Always ending conversations with a pat on my arm and words like, "You must be tired," or "You should rest, Linda." She started calling me Linda instead of Mom after Henry got sick. At first, I told myself it was stress. Then, I told myself it was respect. Now I know what it was. Distance. The last Thanksgiving before Henry passed, I brought out the good china. Our wedding set, ivory with a thin gold rim. And Susan asked, sweet as syrup, maybe next year we should do paper plates. Less fuss for you. I laughed, brushed it off. But she wasn't joking. That night, Eric told me I'd made too much food. Said it made Susan feel pressured. Pressured by mashed potatoes? I'd spent hours making her favorite sweet corn souffle. She didn't touch it. Said she was watching her carbs. When she offered to bring dessert the next year, I agreed. She showed up with store-bought cookies, still in the plastic tray. When Henry first got his diagnosis, stage 3 prostate cancer, Eric stepped in. Let me handle the bills, Mom. I can streamline it. Keep things organized. He looked so serious when he said it. So sincere. I wanted to believe that was love. But the hospice invoice didn't add up. I remember the day I asked Eric for the receipts. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Don't worry about it, he said. It's taken care of. And it was. Just not by him. I should have insisted. Pushed. Instead, I let it go. Because I wanted peace. And peace is what manipulators use like a leash. Susan used to offer me tea when I visited. That stopped too. Then it became, we're just finishing up lunch, or the kids are in the middle of something, or it's not a good time. I began to call before I dropped by. Then I was told to stop dropping by. Then they started saying they'd come to me. But the visits slowed, from weekly to monthly to, we're so busy, can we aim for next month? I adjusted, and adjusted again, until I realized I was the only one doing the adjusting. The week after Henry's funeral, I asked Eric if he wanted to go through his father's workshop. There were tools he might want. Henry's journals. The good compass he kept in the drawer. Eric waved it off, said he was too swamped. Susan, standing beside him in that same polite pose she always wore, said, Don't worry, Linda. We'll take care of it eventually. Take care of it. Like garbage. Like a task on a list. The cruelest red flag of all. When Susan changed the name on the business cards. 1 week after we buried Henry. Linda and Henry Jensen. Greater than Jensen, House B and B. Eric Jensen, proprietor. No mention of me. Not co-founder. Not in memory of. Just erased. I found one of the cards in the foyer on my next visit. A new stack, neat and glossy. A fresh logo, too. No more lighthouse. The lighthouse was my symbol, my family's crest. They replaced it with a cursive J in gold foil. As if we were some luxury resort and not a humble coastal inn, built out of hope and paint fumes, and Henry's busted back. I stood there, holding that card, staring at my missing name. And still, I didn't say anything. I just went into the kitchen and started folding laundry like a damn maid. In the motel that night, I made a list. Every time I'd swallowed my questions. Every time I'd smiled through the unease. Every moment I'd let myself believe this was love instead of slow eviction. By the end, I had 4 full pages. Not of grievances. Of evidence. People talk about the frog in boiling water. How it doesn't notice the temperature rising until it's cooked. Well, I was the frog. And they turned the heat up 1 sweet, smiling degree at a time. I decided to call my niece the next morning. I don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe a lifeline. Maybe just to hear someone say I wasn't crazy. Her name's Colleen. My sister's girl. 38, maybe 39 now, with 2 kids and a husband who sells insurance, I think. We've never been especially close, but she used to send me Christmas cards with glitter on them and little scribbled notes in the corner. When Henry passed, she sent a bouquet and a card that said, "Let me know if you need anything." So I called. It rang 6 times before she picked up. "Hello? Colleen, it's Aunt Linda." A pause. "Oh, hi. Gosh, it's been a while. How are you?" Something about that pause made my stomach dip. "I'm hanging in. Actually, I could use a favor. Nothing big." "Oh," she said. "Okay." The tone had shifted, not cold exactly, just distracted or uncomfortable. I told her, gently, that I wasn't at home, that there had been a bit of a situation, and I was trying to figure out my next steps. I didn't mention Eric by name. I didn't want to sound dramatic. "I just need somewhere to stay for a few days, maybe," I said, twisting the motel phone cord around my fingers. "Just to think. I'd be out of the way." Colleen was quiet. I could hear a television in the background and the faint clatter of dishes. Then, she said, "Aunt Linda, it's not that I don't want to help, it's just, things are kind of crazy right now. Kevin's working double shifts, and Ava's got dance, and our guest room's full of storage. It's all right," I said, voice light. "I understand." Another pause. Then, "Have you tried calling Eric?" And there it was. I'm sure he didn't mean whatever happened. Of course not. No one ever means it. Until they do. I thanked her for her time. She said, "Keep in touch," and hung up without asking where I was. I sat there for a while, the hum of the motel refrigerator louder than it should have been. Maybe I was stupid for calling her, for thinking anyone from that side of the family would help me see things clearly. But that call wasn't about shelter. Not really. It was about hearing someone say, "Yes, this is wrong, you matter." I made one more call that morning, to Susan's parents. They'd always been polite. Dry as burnt toast, but polite. Her mother picked up. "Linda," she said slowly, like she'd been rehearsing how to sound surprised. "Hello, Martha. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Oh, well," she hesitated. "We're just finishing brunch. Can I call you back?" "I won't keep you long," I said, gentler than I felt. "I just wanted to ask if you've spoken with Susan. Or Eric." Another pause. Then a clink of cutlery. Then, "We heard there was tension, and that perhaps you were stepping back, letting them lead." Stepping back. Letting them lead. The phrases were so polished, so neutral. It felt like I'd been erased in passive voice. "I didn't step back," I said. "I was pushed." "Linda," she sighed. "You've had a hard year. Losing Henry, dealing with the business, the stress of everything. Perhaps it's time to rest. Eric's very capable. Capable of betrayal, maybe." "I see," I said. "Well, thank you for your honesty." "You're in our thoughts," she replied, with all the warmth of a doctor delivering bad news. I hung up before she could say goodbye. So that was 2 calls. 2 doors, gently but firmly closed. The world was tilting, and everyone I reached for was busy straightening their place settings. I walked to a diner down the street from the motel. The kind with faded ketchup bottles on the table and waitresses who call you hon. I ordered a grilled cheese and tomato soup. The waitress brought me an extra packet of oyster crackers. She didn't know it, but she saved me from crying. It's a strange thing, isn't it? When someone you raised turns their back on you, it's not just betrayal, it's erasure. I was the woman who rocked Eric to sleep during thunderstorms. Who taught him how to read, how to sew a button, how to drive on wet pavement? And now I was an inconvenience, a reputation to manage, a liability. Back in the motel, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. They wanted me to rest. Well, I would. I would rest. I would wait. And then, when the time was right, I would wake up. And they wouldn't like what came next. Years ago, I mortgaged my share of the business to help Eric open his first restaurant. He promised I'd get it back in a year. He even drew up a little contract on our kitchen table with a borrowed pen and too much confidence. I still have it, somewhere in a filing box marked Eric Investments. A whole folder of promises. The restaurant was called Coastal Fire. He thought it sounded edgy. Hired a local artist to design the logo, had Susan pose for the website photos with wine glasses and smug little captions like curated pairings from our chef owner's family table. My money paid for the entire thing. The build-out, the permits, the imported chairs from Italy, because Susan said aesthetic matters. I didn't argue, I was proud. Nervous, sure, but proud. He was 31, newly married, full of ambition. Henry had just been cleared after his second round of radiation. We needed a win. So I said yes. I took out a second mortgage on my stake in the bed and breakfast, the very business I co-founded, co-managed, co-loved. I put my name on the line so my son could chase a dream. Henry didn't say much, but I remember his face when I signed the papers. That long sigh he gave, like a balloon deflating in slow motion. "You're betting on him," he said quietly. "I just hope he knows what it costs." He didn't. Because Coastal Fire burned bright for 6 months, then flickered, then went out. Too many overheads, too few customers. A chef with a pill habit. Susan's ideas about influencer partnerships never panned out. They let the staff go in January. The lease was broken by April. By summer, Eric was back in our kitchen, sunburned and bitter, saying the market wasn't ready for his vision. Henry poured him coffee. I poured in silence. I never saw a dime of that money again. When Henry got sick the final time, we sold my mother's ring to cover the prescriptions insurance wouldn't. I sold the emerald brooch Henry gave me on our 25th anniversary. Sold the antique vanity I inherited from my grandmother. All to keep up with the bills. Susan once said she loved how sentimental I was. But when I asked her to return a pair of gold earrings I loaned her for a wedding, she said she couldn't remember where she'd put them. That's the thing about sentiment. It only matters when there's something left to take. I spent years telling myself that giving was love, that sacrifice meant something. But now, in this motel room, with brown carpet and bad lighting, it struck me. They didn't love me for who I was. They loved what I gave. I used to make Sunday dinners for 12. Even when it was just the 3 of us. I cooked enough for a small army. I wanted it to feel special. Roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, buttermilk biscuits. I'd bake fresh bread, always, and Eric would rip off the ends before it even cooled. "Can't help it, Mom," he used to grin. "You make it too good." But somewhere along the way, they stopped asking for dinner. Susan started, quote, meal prepping. Eric said Sunday nights were better for resetting the week. Then they asked if we could rotate who hosts. Then they stopped inviting me altogether. I found an old ledger in my purse last night. Just a little spiral notebook I used to jot down grocery totals, staffing hours, linen orders. Inside the cover, in Henry's handwriting, "No one knows the weight she carries." I ran my fingers over the ink until it blurred. They think I'm weak. They think I'm grieving, confused, too old to fight. But grief sharpens some of us. And confusion clears when you have nothing left to lose. They've taken the house, the business, my good name. But they haven't taken the records, the papers, the quiet truth I kept because I thought we were still a family. Well, that was my mistake. I don't want pity. I don't want revenge. Not yet, anyway. What I want is justice. And justice, my darling Henry used to say, is best served quietly. So I started making a new list. Not of red flags. This time, it was names, numbers, dates, discrepancies, things only a fool would ignore. I don't know why I opened the filing cabinet that day. Habit, maybe. But what I found in that top drawer nearly stopped my heart. I'd taken a cab to the house one afternoon while Eric and Susan were supposed to be out of town. Something about a conference in Bend. I told myself I just needed a few things. My sewing kit, a winter coat, a photo album or 2. I still had a key, though I knew that wouldn't last. The house was cold and strangely airless, like it had stopped exhaling after Henry passed. I stood in the foyer, staring at the spot where we used to keep a bowl for keys and pocket change. Now it held nothing but dust and a fake orchid. I walked slowly, not touching anything. Not yet. And then, out of pure muscle memory, I opened the hallway closet where we used to keep the business records. The filing cabinet was still there. Same beige metal, same squeaky drawer. I tugged the top one open. And that's when I saw it. A manila folder labeled Ownership Transfer, Jensen House. My name, Eric's name. The date? 5 days before Henry died. I stared at it so long the words began to blur. My hands shook as I opened the folder. There it was, a scanned document bearing my signature. Crooked, shaky, but undeniably mine. Only it wasn't. I hadn't signed anything in those last days. I was too busy spooning broth into Henry's mouth, sitting with him through the nights when the painkillers failed, holding his hand while the hospice nurse adjusted morphine drips and whispered to me like I was already a widow. I hadn't signed a damn thing. I sat down on the floor, the folder open on my lap, as the walls seemed to lean in around me. It was a clean forgery, just good enough to pass. Not perfect, though. The date format was off, month per day per year, instead of my usual day per month per year. Eric always did that, even on Christmas cards. That's what gave him away. I sat there, cold seeping into my spine from the tile, and I remembered how Henry had trusted Eric to handle the paperwork. "I don't want Linda bogged down in all this while I'm dying," he'd whispered. Eric had nodded, solemn, placing his hand on Henry's frail shoulder like some devoted son from a Hallmark movie. God, he'd taken advantage of his own father's dying days to rob his mother blind. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I didn't take the folder. Not yet. I took photos instead. Each page. Front and back. Timestamps. I made sure. Then I stood in the center of what used to be my home. The parlor. The sunroom. The old dining room where we'd hosted anniversary dinners. And I let something new settle over me. Not grief. Not shock. Resolve. I left before they returned. Walked straight to the cafe near Grace's store and ordered a tea I didn't even drink. I sat in the corner with the photos open on my phone, zooming in, reading every word. There were witness lines on the document, blank, sloppy, rushed. He hadn't even bothered to make it look legitimate. He'd counted on me being too broken to notice. And maybe I had been, but not anymore. When I finally stood to leave, I saw my reflection in the cafe window. My hair was grayer than I remembered. My coat had a coffee stain near the pocket. But my shoulders? They were squared. And my eyes? They were clear. I didn't go back to the motel. I took a room at a small roadside inn under a different name. Anna Lee. Henry would have liked that. I didn't call Eric. Didn't warn him. Instead, I sat on the bed with my notebook and made a new heading, legal leverage, because now I had more than suspicion. I had proof. You know, it's funny what betrayal feels like. People think it's a sharp thing, quick, sudden. But for me, it was slow, like water rising in a basement. You don't realize you're drowning until your ankles are wet, and then one day you wake up gasping. Well, I'd found the leak, and I was about to tear the damn house down. I checked into the inn using a fake name and $100 in cash. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without crying. The room was plain, white walls, a sagging armchair, one of those old quilts that felt more decorative than warm, but it felt like mine. No reminders of who I used to be. No family photos. No echoes of Henry's last breath. Just quiet. I didn't dream. I didn't twist in the sheets or wake at 3 a.m. gasping like I had every night since the funeral. I just slept. When I opened my eyes to the pale light of morning, I realized something strange. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was alone, yes. I was grieving, yes. But I wasn't confused. Not anymore. And the clarity? It was a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The innkeeper was a woman in her 50s named Ruth. Kind eyes, practical haircut, hands that looked like they'd baked 1,000 pies. She didn't ask questions when I paid cash. Just handed me the key and said, "Room 4 gets the morning sun." And it did. I'd sit by the window with a lukewarm mug of instant coffee and let the light soak into my skin. I didn't speak to anyone, didn't answer texts. Of course, there weren't many to answer. Eric hadn't called. Not once. No apology, no explanation. No. Where are you, Mom? Just silence. Funny, isn't it, how quickly people can move on when they've already written you off. That morning, I took out the last letter Henry ever wrote me. It wasn't fancy. Just a post-it, stuck to the fridge 3 days before he passed. He'd written, "Make sure you're protected. People will show their teeth when the meal ends." I used to think that meant life insurance. The will. The bank accounts. Now I knew better. He meant Eric. He meant Susan. I pulled out the envelope I'd tucked into the lining of my overnight bag. Inside, a copy of the original deed for the Jensen House B&B, dated 1982. Owner, Henry and Linda Jensen, equal partners. Nowhere on that paper was Eric's name. That transfer Eric forged? It couldn't override the original contract without both our real signatures. And Henry never signed anything either, which meant I still had legal standing. I still had power. That thought was like a spark in dry leaves. Small, but catching. I walked to the nearest library that afternoon, sat down at a public computer, heart pounding like I was doing something criminal. I searched for Oregon property law, pulled up documents, read clauses, until my eyes blurred. And slowly, the roadmap began to form. Fraud, forgery, invalid transfer of ownership. Words I never thought I'd need. Words that had weight now. I printed 3 pages, highlighted what mattered, tucked them into a manila folder under my coat. When I stepped out into the chilly breeze, I wasn't trembling anymore. I was steady. Later that night, I called a number I hadn't dialed in over a year. Rachel, my oldest friend. We grew up in the same church choir, double dated in high school. I was her maid of honor, and she was mine. We hadn't talked since Henry's second round of chemo. Not because we'd fought, just drifted. But something inside me said, try. Her voice was the same as I remembered. Smooth, warm, like fresh honey. "Linda?" she said, after I told her who it was. There was a pause, and then, "It's about time." We talked for 2 hours. About everything. The motel. Eric. The forged papers. She didn't ask why I hadn't called sooner. Didn't offer empty platitudes. She just said, "Come stay with me. I've got a cabin out by the lake. Quiet, clean, and nobody knows your name out here." I hesitated. "Don't argue," she said. "You sound like someone who forgot she still matters." And I'll be damned. Those words hit me harder than Eric's betrayal. Because she was right. I had forgotten. I packed my things the next morning, left Ruth a thank you note with a 50 tucked inside, and then I caught a ride north, toward Rachel, toward the trees, toward something that felt like hope. Rachel's cabin smelled like cedar and old stories. I unpacked slowly, one sweater at a time, afraid if I rushed, the silence might collapse on me. The place sat at the edge of a lake so still it looked like a secret. A narrow porch wrapped around one side, and a single rocking chair waited like it had known I'd come. Rachel called it the retreat, but it wasn't fancy. Just clean and quiet and full of wood paneling and peace. I hadn't realized how jumpy I'd become until I heard nothing. No voices, no slamming doors, no passive-aggressive silences. Just the sound of a loon calling from across the water and the crack of pine cones falling in the woods. It felt like sanctuary, the kind that asks nothing of you but to breathe. Rachel had left me a note and a stocked fridge. She was staying with her daughter for a few days in town. "Rest," her note said, underlined twice. "Let the moss grow back." I didn't realize I was crying until my tears hit the note and blurred the ink. I fell into a rhythm. Early mornings by the lake with tea. Small walks through the trees. Afternoons on the porch, wrapped in an old wool blanket, watching the sun smear itself across the water. But by the 3rd day, the stillness started to shift, not because it wasn't welcome, but because I couldn't outrun my own questions anymore. Had I raised Eric wrong? Had I made him greedy by giving too much? Had I taught him that love meant sacrifice without condition, so he'd never learn to value the sacrifice at all? The thoughts came heavy, wrapped in blame and soft shame. I started skipping meals. My stomach turned at the sight of eggs. I felt dizzy even sitting still. My hands ached from the cold, but it wasn't just that. It was a deeper kind of tired, a bone-deep unraveling. One morning, I walked down the gravel path to the dock and tried to carry back a gallon of water from the well house. It wasn't far, maybe 50 yards. I got halfway before the world tilted. My knees buckled. The water jug rolled from my arms and bounced off into the brush. I sat down hard on the ground, breath ragged, sweat cold, and I stayed there for almost an hour. I wasn't sick, not like Henry had been, but I wasn't well either. Grief does that. So does betrayal. You stop eating, you stop speaking. And then, one day, you nearly pass out trying to carry a jug of water. That night, I curled on the cabin's couch with a blanket around my shoulders and stared at the flames in the wood stove. I whispered aloud, "What did I do wrong?" The room didn't answer. But in that silence, a softer question crept in behind it. What if I didn't do anything wrong at all? What if I was just convenient to discard once I had nothing left to give? What if this wasn't my failure, but their choice? The next morning, Rachel returned. She took one look at me, pale and hunched in that old rocking chair, and didn't say a word. Just set down her bag, walked over, and pressed a warm hand to my forehead like a mother would. "You look like someone who's been carrying everyone else's weight for 50 years, she said gently. I didn't cry. I just nodded. And then she said, "Come inside. I made soup." Rachel didn't pry. She didn't ask why I hadn't seen the signs sooner. Didn't lecture me on boundaries or self-worth. She just poured 2 bowls of chicken stew, handed me one, and said, "You can start again, from exactly where you are." I took that bowl in both hands, like it was the first gift I'd been offered, with no strings attached. And I believed her. I could start again, not from scratch, but from here, from bruised, from humiliated, from nearly broken, but not broken. That night, I opened Henry's journal for the first time since he passed. There, in the margin of an old page about guest bookings, he'd scribbled a sentence in his neat, slanted hand. If she ever needs to, tell her she still owns half. I traced the words with my finger. He hadn't trusted Eric either, not fully. And somewhere, deep in his practical, quiet love for me, he'd left a breadcrumb. I fell asleep that night with a full stomach and a fire still glowing. Not warm yet, but warming. The next day, I walked into town for the first time in weeks and ran straight into someone I hadn't seen in over 30 years. I nearly didn't recognize her. She was coming out of the hardware store, arms full of gardening supplies, gloves, a trowel, a bag of organic fertilizer slung over one hip like a sack of potatoes. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, but her walk still had that same old bounce, like she had a secret the rest of us weren't in on. "Linda? Linda Jensen?" Her voice stopped me mid-step. I turned. "Rachel?" I said, blinking. She laughed and dropped the bag onto the sidewalk with a grunt. "Well, I'll be damned. You look like a woman who's seen some things." "I have," I said. And then, without warning, we both burst out laughing. The kind of laugh that comes not from joy, but from pure exhaustion. She hugged me before I could think twice. I hadn't been hugged in weeks, not since Henry. We sat in the cafe, 2 lattes between us, and a shared cinnamon scone. I told her everything, not in order, not cleanly, but it came out. The motel, the papers, the forged signature, the filing cabinet. The morning I nearly collapsed. Rachel didn't interrupt, just sipped and nodded, like someone who'd heard stories like this before. When I finished, I leaned back, half expecting her to ask me what I'd done to cause it. Instead, she said, "You know what I see?" I shook my head. A woman who gave and gave and gave, until the people around her forgot she was a person. "You didn't raise Eric wrong. He chose this." My throat went tight. She leaned in. "But you? You're choosing something else now, and that's the start of everything. Rachel offered me her spare bedroom, no questions asked, said she'd rather I stayed where people could check on me. We're not meant to go through reinvention alone, she added. It's not like a makeover, it's more like surgery. So I moved out of the cabin and into Rachel's guest room, with its quilted bedspread and a ceramic lamp shaped like a duck. The first night, she made lemon chicken and we ate it in our pajamas while watching a baking show. I hadn't smiled that much since before Henry's diagnosis. And just like that, I started to feel human again. One morning, while Rachel was at the market, I dug through my travel bag and pulled out the dusty leather folder I'd carried all the way from home. Inside was an old business contract, buried behind years of invoices and breakfast menus. It was the original partnership agreement for Jensen House, dated and notarized. Clear as day, co-owned and cooperated by Henry and Linda Jensen, equal shares unless formally modified with both parties' consent. There it was. In legal language, that couldn't be undone by a fake signature and a smile. Eric hadn't just betrayed me. He'd committed fraud. The next day, I took a bus to the county office in Astoria. Small town, small office, one bored receptionist, and a photocopier that jammed twice while I stood there waiting. I pulled the file for the property title, paid the $10 fee to make a copy, and just as I suspected, the updated title listed Eric Jensen as sole proprietor. Signed, stamped, but not by me. And the signature line for Linda Jensen was sloppy. No witness initials, no notary stamp, just his bold assumption that I wouldn't look closely, that I'd be too wrapped in grief or shame or love to question the ink. I stared at that page until it stopped being a document and started being a turning point. I walked across the street to a law office I'd passed 100 times before, but never thought I'd enter. The sign read, Hartwell and Price, Elder Law, Estates, Property Disputes. It was quiet inside, soft music, a bowl of hard candy on the desk. I asked for a private consultation, said I was inquiring for a friend. The receptionist looked up and gave me a knowing smile. That kind of friend? Yes, I said. That kind. When the lawyer walked in, mid-30s, sharp suit, soft eyes, I stood, but my knees nearly gave. She reached out her hand. I'm Nora Price. What can I do for you, Mrs.? I paused for just a second. Then I said, Jensen. Linda Jensen. Because I was done hiding. Nora was younger than I expected, but sharp as a tack. She took one look at the forged documents and said, We can do something with this. She flipped through the papers like she'd been waiting her whole career for something juicy. I sat across from her, hands folded tight in my lap, trying not to look as scared as I felt. You're not crazy, she said after a moment. This is a textbook case of elder financial abuse. And fraud, at the very least. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those exact words. Not, you poor thing. Not, that's just how family is sometimes. Just, you're not crazy. That's when my hands finally stopped shaking. We made a plan. A real one. Legal, strategic, quiet, for now. Nora explained that the forged signature, combined with the original deed and the missing notary, made the transfer invalid. She said we could contest the title and request an emergency injunction to freeze any sale or refinance attempts on the B&B. She'd seen cases like mine. Said they were rare, but real. I've had women come in here who gave their sons access to everything, she said, leaning back in her chair. And when the time came, those sons treated them like squatters in their own lives. I looked at her and asked, Do they win? She paused, then gave me a small smile. Not if I have anything to say about it. I paid her retainer using money Henry and I had stashed years ago. A private account under my name, opened the year after Eric's failed restaurant. Henry had handed me the checkbook and said, just in case we ever need to be nimble. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now I see it for what it was. Insurance against our own child. Back at Rachel's that night, I poured us both a glass of cheap red wine and told her everything. She raised her glass and said, "To nimbleness." We toasted. Then we laughed. Real, belly-deep laughter. The kind that only comes after weeks of carrying something too heavy to name. I started journaling again. Every day, before breakfast. Not for nostalgia, but for evidence. I wrote down everything I remembered about the way Eric handled Henry's care, the way Susan changed the passwords to the guest booking system, the day the business cards changed without my name. I went through old ledgers, flagged every line that didn't add up. I even called our former housekeeper, Maria, who told me nervously that Susan asked her to throw away a stack of mail addressed to me 2 weeks after the funeral. Mail I never saw, bank statements, ownership notices, things I might have caught if I hadn't been grieving. The more I dug, the more I found. Eric hadn't just forged one document. He'd changed the utilities to his name without my permission. He'd filed a zoning appeal to convert the back garden, my rose garden, into a parking pad for a higher guest turnover. He had taken every inch of our life and prepped it for resale. To him, the B&B wasn't a legacy. It was inventory. One evening, Rachel pulled out an old scrapbook and showed me a picture of Eric at 8 years old, smiling, mud-covered, holding a frog like it was a prize. I stared at that boy, his gap-toothed grin, the scuffed knees, the arms he used to wrap around my neck without hesitation. I whispered, "Where did he go?" Rachel didn't answer. She just reached over and took my hand. And after a moment, she said, "Maybe he was never all the way here." I stopped asking why. I started asking how. How do I protect what's mine? How do I make this right? How do I make sure no other mother wakes up and realizes she's been erased in her own story? The answers were slow, but they came, through legal documents, through old receipts, through memory. And for the first time since Henry died, I felt in control again. Not safe. Not yet. But steady. The lawyer's office sent the letter on a Thursday. Certified. Tracked. A quiet little envelope with consequences tucked inside. It looked so ordinary. Cream-colored. Thin. But inside was a formal notice of pending legal action. Ownership dispute. Suspected forgery. Request for a forensic audit. It had weight. Not physical, but emotional. It was the first domino. Eric would have received it by Saturday. Probably with Susan nearby, flipping through the mail, sipping her almond milk latte in that pretentious gold mug she loved so much. I imagine the color draining from her face first, then Eric reaching for the letter, still in his sweatpants, probably muttering something like, "What now?" and then reading it. My name, my claim, my line in the sand. I didn't wait for his call. I had my own work to do. Nora instructed me to gather statements, proof that I'd been involved in the business right up until the end, that I'd been removed without consent. I started with the housekeeper, Maria. She met me at a diner off Route 6, nervously dabbing her napkin as she spoke. "I knew something was wrong," she whispered. "When Mrs. Susan said not to speak to you anymore, she said you were confused." Confused. The word sat like a rock in my gut. She wrote a statement on the spot. I paid for her lunch and hugged her before she left. She cried. I didn't. Then I called old vendors. The linen service. The baker who delivered the scones. The repairman who'd fixed the downstairs boiler after Christmas last year. They all remembered me. "Wait, I thought you ran the place?" one of them said. "I did," I answered. "And I still do." Rachel drove me to the courthouse in Tillamook so I could file a sworn affidavit in person. The woman at the desk, older, glasses on a chain, lipstick too pink, looked up after stamping the documents and said, "Good luck, honey." "Thank you," I said, "but I don't need luck. I've got receipts." Back at the cabin, I found Henry's old Rolodex. Still smelled like dust and time. Inside, The name of the notary we'd used for every major business update. Mrs. Penelope Briggs. Retired now, but still living just outside of Lincoln City. I called her that afternoon. She remembered us instantly. You two ran that sweet inn by the cliffs. Always had coffee waiting when I came by. I asked if she'd witnessed any deed transfers in the final months of Henry's life. No, she said. The last time I came out there was in 2018. Something about a zoning issue. Why? Because her name wasn't on the forged documents, because no notary was, and that was the final piece. Nora called the next day, her voice calm but energized. He's in trouble, she said. Serious trouble. We've got enough for a motion to reverse the title and a civil suit for damages, possibly even criminal charges, depending on how far you want to go. I sat there in Rachel's kitchen, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, and thought about it. Criminal charges. Against my own son. There was a part of me that winced. Of course there was. But a bigger part, steadier, older, wiser, knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And truth didn't care who it made uncomfortable. That night, Rachel poured me a glass of wine and said, "You know they're gonna come crawling now, right?" "Let them," I said. "I've got steel in my spine and a lawyer who doesn't flinch." She grinned. Now that's the Linda I remember. The next morning, Susan showed up. Not in person. Not yet. But in a voicemail. Her voice trembling. "Linda, please, can we talk? Eric's upset. We didn't mean to hurt you. We were just trying to keep things simple after Henry passed. You weren't in a good state of mind." I stopped listening after that. I didn't delete it. I forwarded it. To Nora. Evidence. That same day, Eric texted me. "Eric, Mom, I got the letter. Can we please talk?" Then, 30 minutes later, "Eric, this is a misunderstanding. I'll fix it. I just need time." Then finally, "Eric, don't do this. Please. I'm your son." And all I could think was, "No, you were my son. Now you're just a man who thought I'd go quietly." 3 days later, Eric was served the formal complaint. Susan showed up at Rachel's house sobbing like a widow. "You're ruining us," she cried. "Please, he's going to lose everything." She came up the gravel path in a fury of designer boots and crocodile tears. Her mascara had already started to run, and I'll admit, there was a small wicked part of me that took satisfaction in that. I was on the porch, shelling peas with Rachel, a big metal bowl between us. We looked like two old hens on a Sunday afternoon, which is exactly what we were. I didn't move when Susan stepped onto the first stair. I didn't even flinch. Rachel leaned over and muttered, "Brace for impact." And then Susan opened her mouth. "You're tearing our family apart," she sobbed. "You didn't have to do this. Eric didn't mean to hurt you. He thought you were overwhelmed. He thought it would be easier if—" I raised one hand, slow and deliberate. "Susan," I said. "Stop." She blinked, stunned by the sound of my voice. Flat, firm, not the soft-shouldered mother-in-law she was used to outmaneuvering. "You're right," I continued. "Eric didn't mean to hurt me. He meant to erase me." She stared at me, open-mouthed. "You don't understand. He's under so much pressure. We're behind on the mortgage, and his job's not what it used to be, and we've poured everything into the B&B. You poured my money into the B&B, I said calmly. You forged my name. You used Henry's death as cover, and you left me on the side of a road like a stray cat." Susan's lips parted, but she had nothing to say. I stood then. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to rise above her. "I buried the man I loved for 43 years, I said, my voice steady as stone. "I lost my home. I lost my son. But do you know what I found?" She didn't answer. "My name," I said. "My backbone. And an excellent lawyer." Behind me, Rachel cleared her throat. "And don't forget your landlady." That nearly broke me into a grin. Susan tried again, voice cracking. He's your son, Linda. Are you really going to let him lose everything? I looked her square in the eye. He already did, I said, the moment he drove away. I didn't slam the door when I went inside. I didn't yell or cry. I just went back to shelling peas in the kitchen while Rachel made a fresh pot of tea. Outside, Susan's car sat in the drive for a full 10 minutes before she finally pulled away. The fallout came quickly after that. Eric called Nora's office twice, then emailed, then tried to file a countersuit, claiming I was mentally unfit at the time of the original agreement. Nora shut it down so fast, it barely made a ripple. She's forgetting who has the receipts, she said, waving the affidavit from Penelope Briggs like a victory flag. Then the title freeze went through, which meant Eric couldn't sell, rent, borrow against, or do a damn thing with the B&B without my signature. Suddenly, I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a co-owner again. I heard through town that Eric canceled his trip to Palm Springs, that Susan took down her Jensen House lifestyle blog, which had been full of photos of the B&B and captions like "Our Family Legacy" and "Built from the Ground Up by Love." Love, apparently, had taken the month off. The community began to notice. People started asking questions. Why wasn't Linda at the inn anymore? Why hadn't she come to the holiday open house? It's funny, when you've lived in a small town long enough, people remember. They may not say it out loud, but they watch. And eventually, they whisper. One of the local shopkeepers even sent me a pie. No note, just a foil-wrapped apology, sweetened with sugar and silent solidarity. I sat with Rachel that night, a slice of apple in front of each of us, and said, "They thought I'd crumble." Rachel looked at me over her fork. "You're the only woman I know who can turn being discarded into a court case." Eric didn't show his face for a while. Too proud, too angry, maybe even a little afraid. But I knew we hadn't had our final conversation yet, and I was ready for it. He looked older when I saw him in the mediation room, hair thinning, eyes ringed and gray. I waited for him to speak first, but he didn't. So I did. We sat across a long conference table in a stuffy room at Hartwell and Price's office. A pot of weak coffee sat untouched between us. The mediator, a soft-spoken man with wire glasses and a neutral smile, welcomed us and asked if we'd like to begin with shared intentions. I almost laughed. Eric stared at his folded hands. His wedding ring gleamed, but his confidence had dulled. Susan wasn't there. Nora said they'd decided to keep it between direct parties. I suspect Susan didn't want to look me in the eye again. "Let's get to it," I said gently. Nora opened the folder. "Ms. Jensen is prepared to offer the following resolution." I didn't need her to speak for me. "I'm selling the business," I said, looking directly at Eric. "The inn, the property, everything tied to it." His head snapped up. "You can't." "I can," I interrupted. "And I will." He opened his mouth again. Nora raised a hand. "Legally, she can. The fraudulent transfer has been nullified. Full ownership rights have reverted to the original agreement. Joint ownership." I leaned in. "But unlike you, Eric, I'm not greedy. I don't want to own it. I want to be done with it." His face was pale. I could see him calculating, running through all the upgrades, the equity, the business bookings lined up for summer. I gave it a beat, then continued, voice steady. "You have 30 days to vacate. You'll take nothing from the sale. No proceeds, no severance, no buyout." His mouth opened, closed. "Let me finish," I said. "You will leave with what you came in with, which, frankly, was nothing. I'll make sure the staff gets their final pay. I'll cover the severance packages for anyone who helped build that place. But you're done." He looked like I'd struck him. "You're serious," he said, voice hollow. I nodded. Painfully. "You'd do this to your own son?" I folded my hands. "No, I'm doing this because you're my son. And I won't allow you to keep becoming someone your father would be ashamed of." Silence. The kind that makes even A mediator squirm. Eric's eyes flicked toward Nora. This isn't about the money. It's about punishing me. Nora's voice was calm. It's about correcting a theft. I made mistakes, Eric said, finally looking at me, his voice cracking. But I was grieving too. I didn't think you could handle things on your own. I held his gaze. No, I said softly. You hoped I couldn't. And then he broke. Not loudly, not like a child, just a quiet collapse. His shoulders rounded, his jaw clenched, his eyes brimmed, but he blinked them dry. I waited. I gave him that dignity, but I didn't budge. The mediator cleared his throat. So, to confirm, Ems, Jensen is retaining legal rights to proceed with sale, and Mr. Jensen is agreeing to relinquish claims to the property in exchange for non-litigation of fraud charges? Nora nodded. With the exception of the possibility of future civil recovery if additional assets are discovered. Eric looked like he wanted to object, but he didn't. He just whispered, "You were never supposed to fight back." I tilted my head. That's the part that still stings, Eric. Not that you stole from me, but that you thought I wouldn't notice. He didn't argue. We signed the papers that day. He left with slumped shoulders and a manila envelope full of nothing. I stayed behind and ran my fingers over the table's edge, remembering all the birthday cakes I'd baked with him by my side. All the Sunday mornings I spent teaching him how to fold napkins, answer phones, welcome guests. What a strange thing, to grieve someone who's sitting 10 feet away. Outside, Rachel was waiting in the car, engine running. She didn't ask how it went, just handed me a thermos of hot tea and said, "Let's go somewhere quiet." And we did. I drove by the inn that evening. The porch light was still on, the curtains still drawn. But it already felt like someone else's story. I didn't stop. I didn't need to anymore. I sold the inn in early spring. A young couple from Seattle bought it. Bright-eyed, polite, no trace of greed. I didn't cry when I handed them the keys I'd expected to. Lord knows, I'd cried over less. The smell of Henry's shaving soap, a song on the radio, a chipped coffee mug that still bore Eric's kindergarten drawing. But when I stood on the porch one final time, looking out at the rose bushes just beginning to bud, I didn't feel tears. I felt relief. The couple's names were Hannah and Joel. Newly married, eager, full of ideas. They walked through the house with reverence, asked respectful questions, scribbled notes in a little shared notebook like students at a sacred site. They reminded me of us. Henry and me, 35 years ago, opening the doors with nothing but a coffee pot, 2 guest rooms, and a stubborn dream. I didn't tell them everything. They didn't need to know the ghosts, just the love. I used part of the sale money to buy a small house near a lake, not far from Rachel's cabin, just quiet enough. 2 bedrooms, a porch swing, room enough for solitude, not loneliness. I planted new roses there, not the same colors. I chose coral and white this time. Fresh starts. I sleep well now. I wake up early, make a pot of strong tea, and sit on the porch to watch the mist roll off the water. Some mornings, it's so still it feels like time's holding its breath. I talk to Henry. Not out loud, just quietly, in that place between thought and prayer. I did it, I tell him. I protected myself, just like you told me to. Sometimes I think about Eric, where he is, what he's doing, whether he still sees me as the villain in his version of the story. I don't hate him, but I don't miss him either. That might sound cruel, but it's the truth. You don't miss the ache when a tooth's finally pulled. You don't miss the storm once your roof's been patched. You just breathe easier. I still miss the little boy Eric used to be, but I love the woman I've become more.